Hey guys, welcome back to another week of discipleship videos. Hope you guys have been doing well this week. As you can tell, we're not in my office this week. We're in the auditorium. And that's just because Cox Internet is here updating our phone lines as well as our internet lines. And so I just wanted to go ahead and make the executive decision to move over here and me get out of their hair. And make sure that I'm not interrupting anything that they're doing and they can still get in my office and run wires if they need to and do stuff like that. They might still be here next week doing things. It depends on how much they get done. So if they are still here next week doing more things, which will be fine if they are. But if they are here next week, we'll be back in here recording for Wednesday again. If not, we'll be back in my office. So as far as announcements go for this week, parents, I've sent out an email probably 2 weeks ago now about updating the Breeze membership stuff. And several of you have already sent stuff back into me. And for those of you who have, I'm super appreciative of that. All of you have done an exceedingly great job with doing exactly what I asked you guys to do. And I appreciate that. And I'm still waiting on a couple more students' information to get to me. So parents, if you haven't sent me the information regarding your student that I asked for in that email, please send it in as soon as possible. It's not like that those things can go unfilled. And so if we want your student in the system, I need those questions filled out. And so if you haven't already, please do that as soon as possible. If I haven't seen anything else in 2 weeks, I'll just have to start reaching out personally to parents. I don't mind doing it. But I just wanted to see if I could get enough information back just from sending out an email to you guys. But anyways, if you haven't sent it in, please send it in as soon as possible. And don't make me go on a goose hunt, pretty please. I don't like goose hunts. I didn't even like dove hunting as like a little boy because I didn't want to wring the neck of the dove. Anyway, I'm not wringing your neck. Okay, so students, my only announcement for you guys this week is we have another Zoom meeting at 5 on Sunday, again, same as we've been doing. For all of you who have made it out for a Zoom meeting, it's been great to see you. It's been great to spend some time with you guys one-on-one, well, one-on however many of you show up in the meeting. But it's been refreshing for me just to see you guys face-to-face and to enjoy spending more time with you guys outside of just sending you guys a text message or a phone call. So the only other announcement that I have is in regards to drive-in church that's coming up Sunday. Instead of it being at 10 a.m. like it has been, this coming up one will be at 9 a.m., which means that the parking lot was opening up at like 9:25 in order for people to start parking their cars for the drive-in service. Now that's going to be bumped back an hour to 8:25, so we're going to open up parking lot at 8:25 for people to come in and start parking first row of cars. And on top of that, we're going to have like more of a different type of sectioned off area that if you want to bring yard chairs or if you want to bring something to sit in outside, we're going to allow you to do that. Still with social distancing measures, but we wanted to be able to give you another option rather than just sitting in your car if you wanted to. And if you wanted to hear stuff, just sitting outside, a la mode or however you would describe it. So that's all I've got for announcements this week. For the Zoom link and all that, it'll be in the newsletter, linked to you guys. And so your discussion questions will also be over there just as normal, and discussion questions will also be linked in the YouTube video description down below, just like normal. So I don't think we have anything else as far as announcements go. I have some fun things in the pipeline coming down. I'm just not quite ready to make an announcement about those yet, so bear with me. And you guys will all hear more about that soon enough. So let's go ahead and get started with our lesson this week. Go ahead and read John chapter 13, verses 1 through 30 for me, please, if you would. That's not the entirety of the chapter 13. I thought that was a spider. It wasn't the entirety of chapter 13, but it is a good chunk of it, and it covers a lot of what I want to go over in tonight's discipleship lesson. So go ahead and read that real quick, and pause the video, and then I'll see you guys back in just a second. Okay, and welcome back. So let's go ahead and hop into this. Next week, I want to talk a little bit more about the Last Supper, and I want to talk about the more of the Passover feast that Jesus shares with the disciples, and look a bit more at the symbolism and what the disciples were expecting versus what they got versus what, us on the outside looking in, what we understand, and just how all of that relates and fits together. But this week, I wanted to focus on an aspect of that feast that they shared together, and that is whenever Jesus is washing his disciples' feet. So this is all taking place, I assume, after supper is finished, because the way that it's described here in the book of John, it says that, he had arose from supper to begin to do this. So I assume they were probably done eating. And so whenever we're looking at the whole aspect of feet washing and stuff like that, normally that happens at the beginning. Like, it happens as soon as you enter the house, usually based on cultural norms and all that, was that as a sign of hospitality, a house would usually provide like a water basin or something at the entryway of their house for you to wash your feet before you walked on and entered into the rest of the house and sat down and ate and all that type of good stuff. But this is kind of like being done after they get done eating. So this is kind of a bit of a different time even to do this. And not only is Jesus going to shock them because the fact that he was doing it in the first place, he himself was doing it, but also the fact of when he's choosing to do it is also slightly odd. To the disciples, it's just a little bit different than, I guess you'd say, the cultural norm of when doing it would have been. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on this whole aspect of feet washing. Feet washing is usually associated with slaves. Usually what would happen is if you were well off enough to even have a slave to do the feet washing in the first place, because I guess let me just put it this way. In a normal household, everybody would just wash their own feet. You would provide the water basin for your guest, and the guests, they would just wash their feet themselves as they came in. And then if you did have a servant or a slave to do this, usually it was like a very, very low gentilian servant that you had. So not only was it not a Jewish person doing it, if you had a servant, it was never a Jewish servant doing it. Say that 5 times fast. Jewish servant. Usually wasn't a Jewish servant. It was always a gentilian servant, and it was the lowest of the servants who would be doing this. Because, just think about it. Like, these people aren't walking around with, boots on. They all have sandals. They have open-toed shoes, in which case, if you're walking around, there's a lot of, dirt, and there's nasty stuff to walk in. None of these places had like super fine sewage systems. So think about just, where a lot of the sewage winds up whenever you are walking around in these big cities or anything. Feet were gross. Feet were really gross. And so to be the servant that's doing the foot washing, that's the grossest of the duties that you could be doing. And so whenever we see this whole relationship between slaves and foot washing, is that the foot washing was always either done by yourself, you did it yourself, or if a slave did it, it was the lowest slave who would do it. So the fact that Jesus was the one doing the foot washing was odd, not just because he's not a gentilian servant, but he has been walking with these guys now for 2 to 3 years, and they don't see him as a servant. They don't see him as a slave. If anything, they see him as a master. And the fact that the master of the house, the master of the feast, is the one doing the foot washing is shocking. So on the topic of, talking about the way that the disciples are viewing this, I always like to look at Peter's example that he gives. Just because when it comes to Peter, I really don't know if Peter was trying to, further his own agenda, or if he was like being super sincere with a lot of things, or if, what it is that Peter's seeking. Because it seems like that Peter is kind of always playing this, not power game, but he's always trying to figure out, where he's going to land in terms of, is he going to be the one who's at the right hand of Jesus? Is he going to be the one who is the greatest amongst the disciples or whatnot? I didn't have you guys read this, but it puts into perspective a little bit of this whole aspect of why Peter is taking the approach that he does in this story. In Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 24, this is the only thing I'm going to read for today, like word for word. It says that a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he, being Jesus, said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves." So, Jesus is setting this example as, obviously if he were to ask all the disciples, who all the 12 who were with him, and then he himself, Jesus, being in this room together, if he were to ask all of them, who is the greatest amongst all of us, they would probably all point to Jesus, and they would probably all be fine with saying, Lord, you are greatest among us, and we are but servants, or whatnot, whatever approach they would be. But then Jesus is kind of setting this precedent in this example of servant leadership and leading by serving, by making yourself low. So whenever Peter takes this stance of, you shall never wash my feet, in other words, Lord, I will never allow you to stoop this low as to be the person who washes my feet. Jesus' response to him is, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have a share with me. Or in other words, you're not in this with me. And whenever he's talking about benefactors, like he mentioned in Luke chapter 22, whenever he's talking about, inheriting and all that type of stuff, whenever Jesus says, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you have no share with me. And the word share is would probably click in a lot of their minds as if you don't get an inheritance of whatever kingdom I'm going to have. In which case, Peter's response is, don't just wash my feet, wash my hands, wash my head, just wash all of me. Just get me covered. And because I'm Lord, I'm willing to do it. I'm willing, Jesus, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to let you just wash all of me so that I can. So I always say that because I don't know if Peter's perspective is really and truly to try and be that one who is at the right hand of Jesus, to try and inherit and be a part of Jesus's kingdom, or if Peter is sincere in a lot of the things that he does. That's something that I'd be personally interested myself in studying more of, but not necessarily with the lesson for this week, because really the lesson this week is this conversation about being a servant leader and the relationship between being a slave, being a servant, and the expectations of what is to happen when it comes to like an event like having a feast or washing feet or anything like that. So let me talk for just a little bit as well in regards to crucifixion, because this isn't something that's always explicitly stated in Scripture. This is more of like a cultural analysis when it comes down to crucifixion, is that the whole reason that people were crucified was to send a message. It wasn't that these people legitimately, like the Roman state, it's not that they legitimately wanted to, have all these people hanging up on the side of the road just for the sake of it. Like, the whole reason that you do public punishment, period, is to send a message. The whole reason that you spank one of your children in front of the other children is so they all get the message that, oh, if I do the same thing, I'm going to get got. It's the whole reason that, that crucifixion is such a terrible punishment. It's such a terrible death to die, is because it's a public death, and all aspects of it are public. The beating, the flogging, the stripping of clothes, the mockery, all of it, it's public. And it's supposed to keep the slaves in check, more or less. So whenever one slave, let's say he stole a basket of bread or something, and then he took it to his friend's house, and then he and the other 3 or 4 friends that were at the house all began eating the stolen bread together. If the Roman state were to go in that house investigating and know that he stole the bread, they would crucify not only the guy who stole all the stuff, but also the 3 or 4 people who were with him, and not only allowed him to continue to go unknown or undiscovered, but they would be hung and everything as accomplices. So it would be sending a message to, hey, first off, this guy over here, he's hanging on this cross because he stole from us. Don't steal. These 4 guys are all hanging on these crosses because they all didn't want to tell us where he was, and they didn't want to turn him in immediately after he had done something to break the law. So a lot of times there were hangings on crosses that were done 100% based on affiliation, based on this idea of they were with him, and so we know that they're one of him. That's going to come into play a little bit later when we see Peter's denial of Jesus. We're going to talk about that 2 weeks from now, I think, 2 weeks, is that there was a legitimate fear of being an accomplice to somebody and your personal life being at risk because you hung out with somebody else who decided to do something that the Roman state didn't like enough. So usually crucifixion was something that was very much, it was a slave's death was being crucified, or it was a thief's death, it was a lowly death. And so Jesus is beginning to paint this picture of lowering yourself to being a slave. I mean, first off, with the feet washing, I mean, usually you either did it yourself, or if you had a slave, the lowest of your slaves would do it. And so Jesus decides he's going to be this person to wash the disciples' feet. So he strips down, puts on a towel. That's another thing that when it comes down to this, it's another element of like publicly lowering yourself is like, not having any clothes on, except for, a towel. It says a towel, but maybe, a loincloth or whatever. He's lowering himself here to eventually show that he's going to die a lowly death, and that he's prepared for that, and he's prepared to do that for them. He's prepared to do anything for those who love him, for the disciples, for all of us. He was prepared to do it. And so much so that, he's calling us to do the same, to lower ourselves, to humble ourselves daily, to pick up our cross and to follow him. When it comes down to all the disciples, they left family, they left their jobs, they left all kind of things to be able to follow Jesus, in a way dying to themselves, taking a lowly death and deciding to follow after Jesus. And so in verse 14, whenever Jesus says, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." He's not necessarily telling them that they should all be going around constantly with bowls of water washing one another's feet. Jesus is trying to paint this picture of living a life as a servant, living a life as a slave. And there's really not a more beautifully humbling picture than to look at your life, to look at my life, and say, how am I being a slave to other people? In other words, how am I living my life in a way to serve others? And I'm not saying that you neglect yourself to the point to where everyone's more important than you, but at the same time, I am saying that we're not the most important people in our lives, or we should not be. I had to come to this whole conversation and this realization whenever I was 17 and a senior in high school, going into my senior year, trying to figure out what was most important in my life, who were the most important people in my life. And I had to come to a point where I was openly having, an inner monologue, if you will, with myself about, I'm not number one. I'm not the most important person here. Kind of like an anti-narcissism, if you will. I'm not saying that I was a narcissist, but for those of you who don't know, narcissism is a mental condition just in which the person believes that they are the center of attention, that they're, like, for example, if they walk in a room, they immediately would assume that everybody in the room is looking at them, even though more than likely not everybody is. But we all have to have this conversation and this monologue with ourselves to humble ourselves and to live lives that are not us centered, to make decisions in our life that are not us centered. Even so much so that every time I read about this story, or when people mention this story, they always talk about Judas, because Judas is still here. He's in the room with everybody else. He's still eating at the table with everybody else, even though Jesus knows good and well that Judas has already betrayed him. Not even as much so Judas was going to. No, Judas had already made the conversation with the Roman guards before all of this happened. Judas was prepared to already have betrayed Jesus, and he did. But Jesus still allowed him to sit at the table and eat. He still broke bread with him, fellowshiped with him, and he still washed his feet. Jesus still washed Judas's feet, even though Judas had already betrayed Jesus. That, in and of itself, is a sermon alone. And think about the people in your lives that you might consider to be a Judas, somebody who hurt your feelings, or somebody who betrayed you, somebody who you just don't like, maybe. What would you be willing to do for that person? And would you be willing to humble yourself so much as to appear like you're their servant? Because there were a lot of people in high school that I certainly wasn't prepared to be that kind of way with. There were people that I had problems with in high school that, I haven't seen since high school, but, they had gotten on my nerves and everything so bad in high school that I had just decided to never talk to them again, period. And I wonder to myself sometimes, if I saw those people in the grocery store or something, what would my initial reaction be? And would it be a Christ-like thought? Would it be a Christ-like action that I had in my heart initially? Or would I be digging back on my flesh more? Would I be, wanting to do something that wasn't Christ-like? Would I be wanting to say something that wasn't Christ-like? But it's important for all of us to remember that Jesus still washed Judas's feet, even though he knew he had already betrayed him. And so whenever we look at this story, whenever we look at this lesson, and we look at our discipleship, and we look at how, we're all keeping each other accountable with the way that, we're either meeting together or having conversations with one another, or, we're opening scripture together. All of this is centered around us developing and discipling ourselves and discipling one another and holding each other accountable for things. And when we look at lessons like this, I think we need to hold each other accountable and be able to have conversations with each other. Be able to look at let's just take Jaden and Davis, for example. If Jaden and Davis had some big argument or something, going to Davis and saying, hey, man, what are you going to do to forgive Jaden? Or go to Jaden and say, hey, Jaden, what are you going to do to be, nicer or more understanding towards Davis? I mean, and that's not usually where we go with these type of conversations. Usually we don't immediately try to find how to have a Christ-like solution about it. We usually say, hey, man, what are you going to do to get back at him? Or what are you going to do to try and run his name through the dirt or something? But Jesus washing the disciples' feet is all about Jesus humbling himself to the point of a slave, because he's going to die a death like a slave. And he's going to put the disciples all in a position to where they're going to have to make a choice of whether or not they're going to stand with him or whether or not they're going to choose to live their lives in a way that protects them. And because Peter is so willing to do all of this and is so willing to say, God, Lord, don't just wash my feet, wash my head, wash my hands, wash all of me, Lord. Peter is always usually the first one to say, I'm ready to do it all. I'm ready to go above and beyond. Peter does say, in here that, he's prepared to die for Jesus. He's prepared to do it all. And then Jesus tells him, Peter, you're not even going to claim my name before tomorrow hits. And so be careful with how ready you think you are to be humbled. So I would just pray that we would all be stronger with each other in terms of our discipleship, our accountability. I pray that we would all be praying for one another, and that we would be thinking about one another more than we think about ourselves. Maybe coming into church on a Wednesday night or something, or coming into youth group on Wednesday night and going up to somebody and being like, hey man, how's your day been? Or hey, I've been thinking about you all day today. What's going on in your life? To just begin that conversation of being there for one another. And it's a lot easier to have a humble mindset whenever other people around you are humble. I know that whenever I was in college, it helped me a lot to be around older guys who were all a lot smarter than I was, who were a lot more experienced than I was in life, who were all a lot farther along in their spiritual walks than I was. And they were some of the most humble people I've ever met in my life. And it was so easy to be humble around them, because it's kind of like the know you thing, to where it's like if somebody's like, let me get that door for you, and then like, oh, well, no you, oh, no you, oh, no you, and just go back and forth. It's so much easier to be the oh, no you person whenever everyone else around you is also being humble. But the world that you guys are going to live in, the world that you guys are going to have to encounter every single day, is not a oh, no you type of world. Most people, and even a lot of people who are in the church, struggle with things like that and live lives that are very them-centered. So be aware of that going forward, strengthen each other, and I want to be able to strengthen you guys going forward. Let me pray real quick, and then I'll let you guys get out of here. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for these students, their parents. I thank you so much for them taking time out of their day to watch this video, to listen to me talk and rant for a little bit about your word. God, I pray that our time of discipleship rests well with each of us, and that we remember it in the days to come, and that we think about the example that Christ set for us. And God, that we be ready to do what it takes to be a servant leader, to live by serving others and being low and being humble about our lives to other people. God, I pray that pride wouldn't overtake us, and I pray that we wouldn't be the first ones to want to try and claim the prize, so to say, that we would be patient, and that we would be humble, and that we would be loving to our neighbors, and that we would be willing to wash their feet, metaphorically speaking, or maybe not, if need be. But regardless, we love you, and we ask that you be with each of us as we leave from here, and as we meet together again on Sunday to talk face to face and hang out a little bit more. We love you and ask all this in your name. Amen. See you guys.